I did the exact same process for the background as the other things. You may notice that the wall that I mentioned here that actually continues over here. Okay, now moving on to some of the more interesting parts. Now over here you may see that the caretaker's sitting position is actually a lot more different than the one that I had in my rough draft. The reason why I changed the sitting position, essentially he was just standing on his knees, which was a bit unnatural. So I had this kind of like reference caretaker. So I took the original image of my caretaker and I had to bend him into this kind of position. And I realized that if he was standing up like that, he would be a lot more taller and he would look a little bit weird as if to why he's sitting in such a position. So after that, I went into my own kitchen and I just decided to recreate that scene to see how would I sit down in that position. Essentially, I came to the conclusion that this position over here is by far the most natural looking position. And leading up to this, I have been making a few rough sketches. I have been doing very rough sketches of trying to get the correct sitting position. Eventually, I reached to this, and I worked up to it and made it a little bit more clearer where the neck is, everything else, all the body parts, and after that, I went on to the second panel and did the same thing, but I just repositioned his body and his limbs and all the other parts. I also added this bigger exclamation mark over here to symbolize that the caretaker is surprised that Charles has hugged him. You may notice that the way Charles is hugging the caretaker now appears more natural rather than just Charles just hugging his leg. Essentially, the caretaker is actually being hugged by Charlie, not just being grabbed by his leg. Okay, now we're moving to strip 3. Now over here you may notice that the previous two panels, I did the same process, filling all the color silhouettes and stuff. But you may notice that the caretaker seems a little bit much different than he is in the rough draft. The reason why he looks a little bit different is let me show you this comparison over here. What essentially the caretaker looked like in the original rough draft. And this is how the caretaker is looking like right now. You may notice that the proportions for the caretaker are a bit off. His neck is a little bit too slim, the body seems a little bit too small, his head was essentially a bit too big. What I came to the conclusion that the caretaker does not look like himself, and he looks more like a kid version of himself. So what I did was I made the torso bigger, the neck longer, I made the arms thicker, and I just had some general improvements, and just adding the shoulders in. What you may notice in this panel is that I added in some text. This alert specimen 13 striked, and that he's actually surprised and he's actually questioning like striked. And this is the next panel after it. I eventually decided to scrap all of the text that appears in this strip. The reason why is this: first of all, this just doesn't make any sense for there to be an alert that Charlie is somehow the specimen, essentially just alienated Charlie and it was ruining this theme of family. Um, yeah, that's why I removed the text from it. You may also notice that I added this surprise face for the caretaker, whereas in the original panels he was just was a blank stare. So this is how the new strip 3 looked like. This is where the comic ends with the caretaker and Charlie hugging each other. This might seem familiar, this scene. Um, the caretaker and Charlie are sitting down. This is where I realized that the lighting for the fifth panel is where the caretaker is putting in the soup is actually looks wrong. Now in this panel, the lighting is also wrong. Essentially, this is where I accidentally mistaken that the light is coming somewhere from this corner over here. You may notice the shadows are going all the way there, and this is where I messed up with the lighting. Now, because of the panel change where the panels are, this made some of the panels larger, some of the panels smaller. Specifically, it made these two panels a bit bigger and wider. This is where I realized that I had to utilize this space to convey the theme of family as much as possible, because these two panels in the rough draft were not really detailed, just showed the face of the caretaker. They did not contribute much, and I actually was deciding to either remove it and add a different panel, but eventually I came to the decision of keeping these panels and adding this kind of equation. So the equation that the caretaker comes up is essentially the thought Charlie question mark led to caretaker being hugged by Charlie. And you may notice that the caretaker is all shocked, the exclamation mark, the sweat droplets. But then the caretaker realizes that Charlie loves the caretaker, and that's why the caretaker was hugged by Charlie. And because of that, basically these two panels improve the other last two panels and emphasize the theme of family. And I also added, instead of a face that I had there in the first draft, I decided to simply have a heart emoji in front of instead of a face for the caretaker, because it was easier to read. For the characters in this room was a little bit off, so I had to change that later. One thing to note is that in this strip development phase, the Charlie's eyes looked initially like this. Eventually, I just changed them. I just made them a little bit bold. I made them bulge out a little bit, just like with the caretaker over here.